on behalf of this eclectic group of people, which includes the Marine Sustainable, I can't even say, Mars Sustainable Solutions team. I can't remember the name of my own team anymore. The Mars Sustainable Solutions team, who are spread, well, mainly based in Australia and in Indonesia. We have some other members of the team also in the UK, and so they're all dialing in. We've got a whole group of our partners that are connecting with us as well. So there's a group in Australia. As I said to you, Richard, before, we might even be joined from Mexico later on. We'll see how that all goes. So we're grateful you've made some time for us. And so Dr. Richard Unsworth here will talk about seagrass meadows. And I'm particularly excited because in our little conversation before the seminar, he said it's often seen really or considered as the ugly duckling of conservation. And I totally agree with him. We know far too little about the magic of seagrass. And I hope that Richard will unveil that a little bit as well from a carbon sequestration perspective, from a fisheries sort of production support, and even as their amazing filtering capacity as well. So that's exactly what he will be doing with us today. He's a senior lecturer at the Swansea University. He's also worked in Indonesia, I think at the Wakatobi. That's where he's met Pippa as well. It's a very small world, it seems to be. And he's worked in Australia, which we've just... So Richard, without any further ado, I'm handing over to you, and I will ask everybody here on the call to go on mute and also remove the video so that we have good quality for the presentation. Over to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you guys for hosting me today. It's a nice opportunity to, I guess, share my sort of knowledge, experience, passion for seagrasses to an organisation that's very, I suppose, coral focused, trying to expand the view of these different components of the marine environment. So, as Jos said, I'm a senior lecturer at Swansea University, but I'm also a director of the Global Marine Conservation charity Project Seagrass, and so although I do a very research-focused role with Swansea University, I do a lot of conservation, community sort of engagement work with Project Seagrass, and that's about pushing the message of seagrass conservation around the world. So I guess seagrasses aren't usually considered to be a hotspot of biodiversity, but if you find a healthy, productive seagrass ecosystem, you will find a vast array of species of fish, of invertebrates, all sorts of plants and animals living amongst this kind of three-dimensional kind of space. And in the Indo-Pacific, seagrass meadows have been documented to contain over 700 species of fish, and they range from the all sorts of species of shark to abundance of rabbitfish, parrotfish, lots of surgeon fish. There's a huge variety there that is often very underappreciated. And because seagrasses, by their very nature, are a sort of a meadow, then the reason that fish are often there is to actually hide in that meadow. And it's not really surprising that as a snorkeler, as a diver, if you actually go into that meadow, sometimes you don't tend to see a lot of fish, and that's because those fish tend to be actually hiding in amongst that meadow. And it's only when you see the big predators zooming around that you see an abundance of fish. but yeah, is a huge diversity, and we've got the cryptic species, and the sort of the seahorses, the scorpion fish, all sorts of weird and wonderful species that are very, very closely associated to seagrass. So yes, they can be considered to be a hotspot of biodiversity in the marine environment. So this biodiversity is ultimately underpinned by the fact that they have very high primary productivity, and that starts from the plants themselves. So these are plants that are adapted to life in a saline environment. So having evolved to live on the land, these plants then actually evolved to move back into the ocean and adapt to being submerged and living in a saline environment. And they're really, really, really productive plants. They're adapted to what essentially are low light conditions in the marine environment. But when the conditions are good, the turnover, the growth of that plant material is very, very rapid, very, very productive. And because those plants settle in an otherwise low diversity, low productivity system, they then create a whole kind of series of resources and conditions that actually facilitate other organisms to be productive. So microalgae suddenly has huge surface area upon which they can actually live and grow and be abundant, and we call that epiphytic material. You can see in this picture those little red colorations on the leaves of the seagrass. They will settle and become incredibly abundant. That creates all sorts of additional resources. And by being such a complex structure, it also encourages more macroalgae to live in the system, more benthic microalgae, and with that you get a really complex food web based around the fact that these plants have been able to settle in what would have possibly been just a mud flat or a sandy bottom with not a lot of life in it. Once you've got the seagrass, you've got this kind of whole complex food web going that's leading to huge productivity and increased biodiversity. If any of you have ever been out wading on a sort of muddy sort of intertidal area, you might have kind of thought that you can kind of smell this sort of stinking rotten egg smell, and that's because you're generally disturbing the sulfide that's in the sediments, and that's because there's no oxygen in those sediments. And when you have seagrass living in a soft sediment environment, they're so productive that they're actually releasing oxygen from their roots as well as their leaves as they photosynthesize, and that oxygen spreads throughout the sediment, and it reduces the amount of sulfide that's present. It pushes that sulfide layer deeper down into the sediment, and with it you've kind of got this huge niche for animals to then settle into. So you get a lot of biodiversity that lives in those sediments, facilitated by the fact that you've got seagrass present. And as I alluded to earlier, you've got these epiphytes that are growing in that system, and these epiphytes in certain conditions can be incredibly productive, and themselves can actually facilitate enormous food webs and be a source of supporting biodiversity in an otherwise kind of lowly productive systems. But the three-dimensional complexity that seagrasses can create is really quite amazing. And if you're a fish or a shrimp moving around a sand flat, you've got nowhere to hide. But seagrass is creating this complexity, this place that all sorts of beasties can hide, and with it a whole complex food web supporting a lot of diversity. Seagrasses are a sort of a coastal bioengineer, and what they're doing is facilitating an environment that's more affable for themselves, and leading to more productivity for themselves, and with that a lot of kind of I guess follow-on benefits from being present. And one of them is the fact that if you're in a shallow bay where seagrasses like to be abundant, and water is moving throughout that bay, then as the seagrass grows into the water flow, then actually that seagrass then will actually reduce the speed of that water, because basically you've got a lot of slowing of the water as it drags over that seagrass, and with it, once the water's slowed, you get particles that want to actually then settle out, and once you've got particles settling out, then it creates a more affable environment for everyone, and that means there's more light in the water column. The conditions are better for animals that want to settle, and it also then enhances the settlement of invertebrate and fish larvae into those environments. So it's self-facilitating its own environment, creating a sort of positive feedback mechanism where the more seagrass you get, the better the conditions are, and that has follow-on impacts to the whole local environment. And that's basically a place where animals want to live. So it's not really surprising then that we, as we travel around seagrass meadows all around the world, we see that they're pretty important for fisheries. And there's kind of three key roles there that I want to talk about today. One of them is the role that seagrasses play as a fish nursery habitat. The second is that the actual organic carbon that seagrasses produce is often exported into other localities, other environments, and that has a trophic subsidy upon the whole coastal environment. And when you've got a habitat that's full of fish, it's full of invertebrates, people know that, and those fishermen, whether they be recreational, subsistence or commercial, are basically chasing every fish present in that seagrass all around the world. Back in 2019, John Lefchek, a researcher at the Smithsonian, did a fantastic meta-analysis of the role of different coastal habitats in supporting juvenile fish. And we know that if you're a juvenile fish, you need to grow, you need to survive, and if you're to actually enhance the population, then you need to be in high abundance within that nursery habitat. So John looked at these three different kind of key factors, looking at how fish survive, how they grow, and how dense they are in those seagrasses. And here he's referring to seagrasses as SAV, or submerged aquatic vegetation. And he compared those roles relative to other habitats around the world. And you can see, you know, coral reefs, mangroves, biogenic reefs, they all have important values as nursery habitats. One of the key points about seagrass as a key nursery habitat is that it's consistently got a value for improving the survival, improving the growth, and of having a high density of juvenile fish. And the reason I say a consistent role is that if you look at this figure and you see submerged aquatic vegetation as the top kind of green circles, you'll see that the variability from those values is much reduced when you compare it to say mangroves or biogenic reefs, which have got highly variable roles as nursery habitats. But seagrass has always got that role. Whether we're looking at a seagrass meadow in Wales, in the UK, or whether we're looking at it on the Great Barrier Reef, we're always finding abundant young fish that are surviving to a higher level and that have a improved growth rate because of their presence in a seagrass meadow. And it's not surprising, therefore, when we actually look at those nursery roles and we actually apply them to some of the species around the world that are being fished to the greatest degree, then there's quite clear evidence that those fisheries are being supported by seagrass meadows as nursery habitats. So things such as the Alaskan pollock, Atlantic cod, the herring, they are by far the world's biggest fisheries, and they are supported by seagrasses. This doesn't mean that when you lose seagrasses, you lose all these fisheries. Seagrasses are the only nursery habitat, as this figure quite clearly illustrates. But it basically means that if you're going to put a fish in a nursery habitat, seagrass is a very good one, and it increases its survival, it increases its growth, and the likelihood of it becoming an adult and spawning a next generation is improved by spending time in a seagrass meadow. So to put that in some form of context, if you're a young fish and you're settling into a coastal environment, then you're trying to find habitat. And if you don't find habitat, you might be the sad fish. That you might be living in an environment that's kind of muddy, it's quite turbid. There's nowhere to hide, and there's not a lot of food about. So you're spending a lot of energy chasing food. You're spending a lot of energy running away from predators, and the water's quite turbid, so you can't really see what's going on. So your stress levels are quite high, and you're not in great condition. Your chances of putting on weight, growing rapidly, are diminished. And we know that the weight of a young fish at the end of its first year is a very good indicator of its chances of actually spawning another generation. But then put that fish into a seagrass meadow, and suddenly it's very happy. It's got somewhere to hide, and with that, its stress levels are pulled down, and it's not spending energy running away from predators. There's also a lot of food there. You know, all these epiphytes creating this food web of crustaceans grazing on it. That's a great resource for a fish to utilize to fill its belly without actually spending a lot of energy chasing that food. So suddenly that fish is in a very happy environment. And without that seagrass, the chances of survival are reduced. The potential population level benefits of spawning are reduced, because more of those juvenile fish die or don't make it to the spawning population if they don't have a key nursery habitat to help support them. And I wanted to give some examples of this at different kind of scales, really, to show you that the importance of seagrass as a nursery habitat has been looked at in many parts of the world at different kind of spatial scales. And there's a really good study conducted in the Mediterranean by Emma Jackson, and this basically utilized the fact that there's been a lot of work done on fish populations in different habitat types in the Mediterranean, so they could compare the relative value of different nursery habitats. That the information was available for all the key species that were being commercially exploited, and they were able to determine that seagrass associated species contributed 30 to 40% to the value of commercial fisheries landings, and approximately 29% to recreational fisheries expenditure. And the economics of that are enormous. It's a major sort of £100 million euro contribution to the economy of the Mediterranean each year, and that's just its sort of its nursery role. So major importance at regional scales. And the reason I show this example is it's a rare example of being able to show that value at a regional level, because the data is there. It's not because seagrasses don't necessarily have these values at other parts of the world. It's just that the Mediterranean, they have that history of doing a lot of that work. The very high visibility in the water column in the Mediterranean makes assessment of fish populations a lot easier than in other parts of the world. So I referred to the fact that seagrasses have a role as a provider of trophic subsidy. Now, this is a tropical figure from a paper written by Ken Heck and a group of top scientists a number of years ago. And what they're showing here is that seagrasses are incredibly productive, as in the center of that figure. But that productivity isn't just staying in the seagrass meadow. It's moving. It's being taken by various different vectors to other parts of the marine environment. So you might have a dugong, for instance, coming into a tropical seagrass meadow, grazing on that seagrass, and then that dugong then going into deeper waters, excreting a lot of that carbon, supporting other systems. You might get storms coming through in the autumn period, breaking off a lot of that seagrass matter, the seagrass carbon, and that carbon then floating on the surface, and as it rots away, it then goes into deeper oceans. And there's a really great paper that was published back in the 1970s about the deep parts of the Atlantic Ocean. And what they found is that there are whole ecosystems that exist in the deep oceans of the trenches that are off the Bahamas, that are 100% dependent on seagrass organic carbon. So that seagrass is growing plentifully on the ground banks of the Bahamas, is then going out to the sea. It's rotting and it's going deep to sort of thousands of meters deep, and in that environment it then spurns a whole kind of ecosystem of species that are growing and reproducing on that organic carbon. And although we don't know the fisheries benefit of that, there's got to be a huge kind of fish abundance that's associated to it. So basically that it's important to recognize that the productivity of a seagrass meadow is not just supporting fisheries in its own internal meadow, but it's supporting fisheries at a wider level. And whether that's fish communities such as snapper, rabbit fish that are migrating in and out of a seagrass meadow to feed on a daily basis, or it's fish coming in and out of a mangrove forest. They're utilizing those resources, and therefore that seagrass is actually supporting the productivity of the whole coastal seascape and not just itself. And that's the kind of, I guess, the power of the three, the sort of the perfect scenario from a tropical and a temperate environment, is to have these linked coastal ecosystems. So seagrasses being in the middle, I guess, and you've got the mangroves up on the upper shore, the reefs a bit deeper and further offshore, but they're all linked parts of that coastal seascape. There's not been a lot of hard data collection on the fisheries that are associated to seagrasses around the world. And I've been interested in this topic for a number of years. We looked for that data, it wasn't present. So what we did is we actually did a huge survey of fisheries and seagrass scientists all around the world and asked them questions about the activity that they know happens within seagrass meadows in their area. And we thought seagrasses were important for fisheries, and but we were actually quite amazed at the information that we got back from those experts that really highlighted that it's far more important than we even thought. So where there is seagrass and there are people, there are always people exploiting fish in those seagrass meadows. And no one provided an example where that wasn't the case. And they're always, it's not that they're doing it by accident because they go out with the fishermen and they just drop a line or a net in any location. They do it because they're targeting that seagrass meadow because they know there's a high abundance of animal life in it. And that exists at the whole series of different levels. And in this image here, you've got fish fences, spear fishermen, people using small sand traps, people going out at low tide with a hand net. There are all sorts of different activities that are happening in seagrass meadows to collect an abundance of fauna. And sometimes that's at a very commercial level with big kind of gill nets. Sometimes it's that very kind of, I guess, subsistence value where you've got women and children out collecting animals in that seagrass meadow. And that kind of gleaning activity, as we refer to it, with communities out collecting animals in seagrass, is incredibly abundant around the world. So here's some pictures from Indonesia, part of the world where I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of work in Salaya, south of Makassar, and done a lot of work over in the Wakatobi, a bit further over in Southeast Sulawesi. And what we found is that there's a huge amount of evidence that where you've got these intertidal to shallow water seagrass meadows, that they're full of abundant sea life. So whether that be things such as sea cucumbers, like the Holothuria scabra, which is on the left, or Lambis lambis, a species of conch, wherever these abundant intertidal seagrass meadows exist, there are a lot of large macrofauna present. And what that means is that with little in the way of resources and fishing gear, you can collect your daily food. So all you need is a bucket and 2 legs, and you can get out there. And sometimes people use various types of rebar or scoop nets to assist them, but largely it's just using their own hands to collect everything from urchins to bivalves to conch to sea cucumbers, a huge array of fauna is actually collected from seagrass meadows all around the world. And these sorts of fisheries are often off the data to records, and they're largely dominated by women and children, and but therefore they're critical parts of the food supply of many hundreds of millions of people. And in many parts of the world where people don't even recognize that these sorts of fishing activities exist, as you start to scratch the surface, you find that they're in huge abundance. And a neat example of that is some work we did in the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean a number of years ago, where all the fisheries officers said, no one does that. No one does that at all. We don't give any licenses to that activity. No, never heard of it. But in the Turks and Caicos Islands, they have a group of people referred to as the non-belongers, mainly Haitians, who have basically come to work as cleaners in the hotel industry, as sort of low-skilled jobs. And what they do is that on the cover of Dark, they actually go out fishing on the low tides and collect a whole series of abundant seagrass invertebrates. And that activity is essentially illegal because they non-belongers do not they don't have rights to a fishing permit. So by their very nature, that activity is illegal. But it supplies a huge amount of food to these local people, of huge importance to food security, and those people are amongst the most vulnerable in society. And that sort of story seems present in many parts of the world, where it's those that don't have huge wealth, that live in the coastal environment, and they can utilize very little in the way of resources to get an abundance of food on a daily basis. And we did some studies in South Sulawesi. I worked with a PhD student, Forcon, based at Hasanuddin University, in collaboration with Rohani Ambarape, many of you will know. And we examined these intertidal fisheries throughout the region, and we found that they were of critical importance to local food supply, that they were dominated by women and children. And importantly, we found some evidence that points to the fact that as you get higher abundances of seagrass, you tend to get higher catch per unit effort from those fisheries. And although some of our data on that is not as strong as we'd like, we're beginning to understand that picture, that seagrass is a critical part of supporting those sort of intertidal fisheries. And when you scratch the surface of the literature and start looking for examples of this sort of gleaning activity, you find it all around the world. And these little green blobs here, and the colours actually are a bit poor on this map, but you can see that they spread from parts of Alaska all the way to Fiji. People are walking at low tide out onto seagrass meadows to collect animal life to support their daily subsistence needs. And when we look at seagrass habitats as like local case studies and how they support actual fish productivity and fisheries, we find similar kind of trends. And this local case study here, which I'm not going to go into huge detail on, is from the Wakatobi in Sulawesi. What we found is that there is very high association between the fish communities that are being caught, being sold in the markets, being favoured by people's consumption through household interviews, are very closely associated to seagrass, and that seagrasses are a vital part of supporting food security in many localities such as the Wakatobi, around the world. But many of these seagrass fisheries activities are often unregulated, unmanaged, and largely unsustainable. And examples of this is that we've done some work recently on the coasts of East Africa, showing how big donor funding from the likes of the Gates Foundation have tried to solve the problems of malaria, but with it handed hundreds of thousands of mosquito nets for use in fisheries that are decimating the fish communities in shallow water seagrasses. We published a paper with members of the Mars team, actually now, Dave Smith and his wider team, on fish fences around the region, static fish fences that are left in perpetuity, and they just basically collect and decimate the fish communities with huge levels of bycatch. And it's because seagrasses are this sort of ugly duckling of marine conservation that those activities that happen in a seagrass meadow are often kind of grouped as being, that's reef fisheries, that's reef, that's about fishing on the reef. But actually the impact is being seen on the seagrass meadows, because that's where people are actually fishing. And the longer that seagrass remains off the sort of marine conservation radar, the less its fisheries are considered, and the environmental problems of that worsen. But seagrasses, unfortunately, are globally in decline, and in a very poor state. There's lots of evidence from all sorts of case studies that we have seagrasses being dredged up for LNG terminals. We have poor water quality in the UK damaging seagrass. We have all sorts of impacts happening on seagrass all around the world. And although we don't have perfect data sets that kind of that show some of that, the historical ecological knowledge, the different bits and pieces of case studies comes together to actually provide a very big picture that seagrasses are being lost. We recently did a study looking at expert witnesses on understanding seagrasses around Indonesia, and we discovered huge amounts of evidence of vast loss of seagrass throughout the Indonesian archipelago. In the UK, we've done some similar exercises looking at historic data, and we're showing vast levels of seagrass loss. So we understand that seagrasses are vitally important for fisheries productivity. We understand that the global population of humans on the planet is rapidly increasing. We know that we need to increase our take of marine resources to feed our growing world population, yet we're not supporting the habitats that actually support that productivity. In fact, we're actually allowing them to continually degrade. And that has major consequences. This figure by a study by some guys in Griffith in Brisbane explains that as you break down that healthy seagrass meadow, it has a whole series of cascading impacts upon the fish communities, the fishing activity, and the overall fish stocks. And here's just some case study really examples that highlight places where seagrasses have been rapidly lost over time, or where you actually consider that the variability in those seagrass meadows relative to catch, then you can actually see that as that seagrass declines, you lose productivity in that fishery, you lose support for those people who are very much dependent upon that seagrass meadow on a daily basis. But seagrass is a plant, and plants, you know, as a human race, we've been very good at working with, growing, and you know, our agricultural systems are pretty sophisticated. We can actually grow plants, and it's not surprising that as time goes on, and as people have researched and investigated the means of restoring seagrasses, it is actually quite possible. You dig through the history, you look at some of the older scientists who've worked on seagrass restoration, and they're very negative about the ability of seagrass restoration to lead to the recovery of these systems around the world. That's because historically we had to understand, we had to learn about what works, and there's been some very good global reviews that have looked at how seagrass restoration has happened in all sorts of parts of the world, and we now know that you need to do it at scale. You need to be able to examine whether the environment is suitable for that seagrass. You need to you can't just go out and plant seagrass. You've got to understand the environment. You've got to use the right methods that are suitable for the right environment. And in many places, you've got to think about some of the complex ecosystem components that might actually influence that restoration. But the global evidence suggests that if you bring those kind of things together, you get those stars aligned, then you can very effectively restore the world's seagrasses. And there's no better example of that than Chesapeake Bay in the US, where Bob Orth, particular kind of scientist, has worked with seagrass restoration over many decades, and they've restored thousands of hectares of seagrass in Chesapeake Bay. And that's by investigating all these different processes, looking at how seeds germinate, looking at the conditions that seagrasses require to be able to recover. And based on that, we've set up a whole series of research trials and work in the UK that's kind of that's mirrored that and adapted their protocols. We've got all those nuts and bolts together. We've looked at environmental conditions. We've looked at how we need to tweak some of those methods for local suitability. We've looked at the wider ecosystem, and we have a project called Seagrass Ocean Rescue in the UK, which is bringing seagrass restoration to the UK for the first time. It's quite exciting. It's quite nice to be part of, and we are seeing a lot of seeds of hope in the UK. And I think that people around the world are beginning to pick up on the value of restoration of seagrasses to support coastal biodiversity. In this talk, I've not really mentioned the value that seagrasses have for storing carbon, but a quick look at the literature and on the internet, you'll find a lot of information about how seagrasses are storing carbon, and that's one of the big drivers that is facilitating further investment in restoration of seagrasses around the world. So hopefully, as time goes on, many of those seagrass meadows that have disappeared, that have been degraded, then actually they can actually be restored through a process of restoration using the best science. And it's not surprising that when you plant a seagrass meadow, then very rapidly the animals turn up, and you get ecosystem benefits very quickly. There's various studies that have looked at the fish communities, the carbon storage, the invertebrates living in those seagrasses, and you can bring that life back to a degraded coastline very rapidly over a period of 5 to 10 years. So the hope really is there that you can restore these seagrasses. So just in conclusion, seagrasses alter their local environment. They enhance biodiversity, and basically they make a huge impact upon fisheries productivity at local, regional, and global scales. And we have lost seagrasses all around the world. We continue to lose seagrasses all around the world, but with the right science, you can actually restore them and contribute to the recovery of fish populations. Here's a little video. And yes, thanks for listening, and over to you for any questions that I can answer about our seagrass work and the importance of seagrasses.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm already, you know, everybody please come online, and if you unmute as well, then the first thing is not just seagrass rocks, but I think you rock too, Richard. So let's so we can. Good. So anyway, I'm just clapping myself here, right? We might have to add some sound effects whilst everybody's coming online, but I just wanted to say a big thank you, because you've been able to bring this topic that is often, you know, seagrass that is literally overlooked in so many different ways to life in a way that I've never seen before, Richard. So for that alone, I think your presentation is worth gold. The one slide you have on the pea fish and the sad fish, I think you should copyright, because it certainly got me going. It was great. What I'll do, I need to sort of go offline at 10 o'clock sharp. So what I want to do is open it up for questions, and at 10 o'clock I will hand over to manage any further questions that you might get. Okay, Richard? So just so that we don't rush through it. So can I open the floor for any questions that people might have? And please raise your hand if you can, and make sure that I can see it. Just going through, I mean, I can't see everybody at the same time, so I'm just hoping. Is there anyone? Please speak up. Otherwise, I'll go.
I've got one.
Oh, yes, Pippa.
Rich, I was going to ask you a couple of things just to kind of relate back to our restoration from a coral reef perspective. When we're restoring the reefs, we always work on rubble areas to restore, because we're not going to build somewhere that hasn't actually had a reef there previously as such. Do you have to use, it's a two-part question actually, I'm being a bit sneaky. Do you have to use the same sort of protocols when you're restoring seagrasses in terms of the productivity of the sediment that you're working on? And the second part to that is when you were referring to your case studies. I know that you obviously in the UK, you were here in Indonesia and in Cairns. Have you found that the recovery rates have been different in terms of success based on the amount of usage and the different forms of usage of those seagrass beds by fishermen, et cetera, in the different regions that you've been working in?
I guess to answer your first question, Pippa, the work that I've been doing on seagrass restoration is primarily temperate work in the UK, and that operates slightly differently in terms of the species that are present and how you can actually restore them as opposed to the tropics. But they both rely on the principles of making sure that the environment is suitable for that seagrass. So different levels of complexity. We do a lot of habitat suitability modeling. So using both kind of sort of large data sets to look at physical environmental conditions, from the right sediments to the wave action, to the slope of the coastline, to currents, and then linking that to what are often smaller scale data sets and more local data sets on the environmental conditions from light availability, particularly salinity, and looking at any other pollutants in the local environment. So, at the moment we've got a case study of a potential restoration site in the UK, and we've done all that habitat suitability modelling, but we've got a concern about heavy metal, historic heavy metal work. So we're doing additional surveys there. So basically, where seagrass restoration has failed historically, it's a lot of the reasons is because they've not got the conditions right in the first place. And I don't know the literature very much on coral reef restoration, but I've had experience of seeing it in places where it's failed, and I suspect that is a big factor. That if your environment's not suitable, then what's the point in doing it? It's just throwing money in the bin, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's definitely a key part of it. And in some parts of the world, you have the luxury of I don't know if it's a luxury, but you have the knowledge that seagrass used to be there, and therefore the conditions used to be suitable for it. Whether they are now is a different matter. In the UK, we don't have that kind of luxury, in that a lot of seagrass was lost such a long time ago. It's very sporadic records of that and anecdotal information, and therefore we rely on those models to be able to also make those decisions. In terms of your questions about recovery, I think there's a very neat example that I once heard Carlos Duarte, sort of one of the world's top kind of seagrass, world's top marine biologists, I guess, describing from the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, where they invested what at the time was the biggest amount of money in an environmental conservation project in Spain's history, in seagrass restoration, and the story relied on his information, not mine. I don't know the spot. And basically, after 2 years or 3 years of the scale of the project, there was very little recovery in that seagrass. They planted it, and it kind of got dragged through the sort of right-wing press, all this kind of greenwashing. It's just scientists taking the money, getting nowhere with it. What have they done? What have they actually achieved? And the scale, the temporal scale of the project necessitated that they had these targets to achieve, and they failed to achieve any of those targets in terms of actual restoration. But after 10 years, 7 years later after the project, it's probably one of the most successful seagrass restorations projects in Spain. It's just you don't see the recovery in the time span of the donor and of the people who are kind of managing the money. So it's very difficult to always see that recovery in timescales that are realistic from a government and a funding perspective. And when you look at what's achieved in restoration in Chesapeake Bay, there's lots of small projects as part of that bigger thing that have failed. Some of them have been very good, but the overarching thing is that all that work together over like 30 years of doing water quality work, of doing restoration, has resulted in thousands of hectares restoration being effective. But if you cherry pick at little scales and look at failure rates and this sort of thing, and do it at short term, then you won't see any success. But the evidence really is that over 30 years, that restoration work has been a massive success.
Thank you, Richard.
Amazing.
Sorry, I'm just so aware that there are other people asking questions already to me virtually. Sorry. So I make sure that we. But I'm going to have to. So Rowan will be next in line. So Pippa, I'll hand over to you
no problem.
to them. The only thing I would say as well, a big thank you again, Richard, because I've learned a heck of a lot just about the value of seagrass as well and its connectivity. Things really wasn't aware of. So that's been great for me. The whole piece around seagrass restoration, would love to know a little bit more about the numbers and the successes and the failures, but we can take that offline as a team with you as well. The fact that there are some great examples, being able to put seagrass loss into perspective, I would also love to understand. So that is my one question, I guess, when you talk about the dramatic loss in seagrass for all human activity that we know about, how does that actually look over a long period of time? Are we, is it looking sad or not? Or are there natural flows, ebbs and flows, and peaks? So I just had a few questions about the longer term perspective, but I'll hand over to Pippa for you to maybe answer that question at a time that is right. First of all, hand over to Rowan, and I'm just going to say bye-bye to you all, and thanks again, Richard. So
thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Go ahead, Ro.
Hi, sorry. Thanks for the talk, Richard. It was really interesting. I just had a quick question about, obviously you mentioned that you would take different approaches for specific areas. I was just wondering whether there's any major differences in specifically looking at temperate ecosystems compared to tropical ecosystems when you're restoring seagrass.
Well, massive differences, I think, is the crux there. That they're all plants that are living in the ocean, but their life history sort of traits are very, very different in that the way that they reproduce is very different. So Zostera marina, the species we're working with in the UK, we're able to pick 1 million seeds with a couple of teams of divers this summer. A lot of complicated logistics, but we were able to do that. And the species of tropical seagrasses don't necessarily operate like that. They don't produce so many seeds. There are some species of haliduli that produce high numbers of seeds that are left in sediments for long periods. And people have trialed ways of trying to collect them at large scales, but that remains quite difficult. So it tends to be a lot of the tropical seagrass restoration. It tends to be on replanting, basically using fragments, and in some cases growing seeds in labs. So there's one particular species, Anhalus acaroides, that's it's very big. It produces big seeds, and but in low abundance, and people tend to grow them out. So although there is a lot of success happening now in terms of tropical seagrass restoration, it's not happening at the same scales because it's so more expensive. So time consuming to actually conduct those things at large scale. You know, the examples from the Chesapeake Bay, where they're actually able to literally go out on a boat and throw seeds from the boat so successfully that they were able to write the name of their donor in a pattern of seagrass seeds in their boat that could then be seen from space, because they're just throwing the seeds out from the boat. But it's not so simple in the tropics, and although there is a lot of success and people are getting there, I'm not aware of any large scale projects that are really hitting the big numbers in terms of restoration that places in other parts of the world are achieving. But the people are getting there. Yeah, but it's those life history traits that are very different about individual species that are quite complex. And also in the tropics, then they're multi-species. So in some parts you get different species being restored together, so that actually complicates it. So it's not like you just plant one plant and the seagrass grows. You know, you've got to think about multiple species, and in themselves they've got different life history traits of how you actually plant them. So yeah, it's not a simple process at all.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Ro. Thank you, Rich. Rich, I'm just going to stop sharing your screen so that I can just see everybody. There we go. Okay, any other questions that we have from the floor? Katie, go ahead.
Hi, Rich.
Hi.
Hi. I'm just curious about your involvement with the restoration there in the UK, about more from the political and social will to be involved. I mean, are you getting a lot of support from the government, from the community to back this move? I mean, the Chesapeake is a great example now to show what has been done. Are you seeing that within your sort of local area?
What's interesting there is that we're getting incredible levels of support from the big sort of NGOs. We're getting some support from sort of the very top of government, but at the local level, it's been the worst kind of the most challenging bit of science I've ever been part of. Local opposition to conservation in the marine environment has been huge, staggering, and that's essentially because, you know, seagrasses, they want the same environment that a boat wants. They want, you know, the shallow sheltered, as you well know, you know, the shallow sheltered environment, and you therefore get this natural clash in the UK. And as a quite a maritime nation, we've every single sheltered water is full of expensive yachts. So that is a major clash, and there's been a whole series of historic sort of clashes in other places around the UK, which are quite well documented with you know, conservation discussions on forums that, you know, it doesn't take you long to find negative views about seagrass in the UK if you're a boat owner. So it's been very, very challenging. But having said that, we've had some big wins, and we've achieved things that no one else has done in the UK before, and you know, by keeping talking with people, and that's been the entire thing. That, you know, however difficult our discussions have become, we've kept talking, and we found solutions, and that's pretty cool in itself. In the way that we've managed to change local management plans, all sorts of things to respect people's livelihoods and activities, whilst also achieving the seagrass restoration goals. So very, very tough, but I think it's also driven by the fact that no one has ever tried to restore the ocean in the UK. It's like in parts of the US, it's an established sort of part of people's mentality, but in the UK it's not. It's not there at all. So you're like, and it's almost this sort of naive view that somehow our oceans are fine, you know, and that, you know, it's pristine. Like, but yeah, there are big challenges, and I think that wherever you start kind of playing around in the seabed, and there's local activities, there's going to be some level of at least suspicion or conflict that comes with it, that has to be negated, and so that whole stakeholder engagement is a key part of our work in the UK, both now and going forward, and it'll have to be part of it, or otherwise it will fail. And I guess that links back to Pippa's question also about those sort of interactions, and we've now got in West Wales a situation where the fishermen are actually quite proud of what we're doing, and want to be part of it and want to help protect it. But 12 months ago, I thought they would have got a trawler and dug the whole lot up, So it's tough. It's not simple, but if you're doing something new, then you've got to accept that, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for your question, and Rich, that was great. Rich, how are you doing for time? If anyone's got a last question, are you?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I'll take. I know we've run over. Noel, I know you've got a question, so we'll take Noel's as the last question, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So Noel, go ahead.
Yeah, less of a question, Richard, but maybe some information. I've been beaten around the head for many years about seagrass, because I worked many years with Susan Williams, and she was always pounding on us about the importance of seagrass relative to coral reefs. So just an observation, the issues you talk about with seagrass, it seems to me like it really needs some celebrity status. It's some celebrity to get on board with it. The coral reefs are pretty and colourful and all this sort of stuff. There's lots of people. Even though they're not visible above water, there's a lot of visibility around coral reefs, and it doesn't exist really with seagrass. Even in some places, because seagrass is in shallow water, it upsets the beautiful blue colour of the sea for photographs, in tourist destinations, and so tourism operators will take it out even because it's ugly. So I think there's something that needs to be done better, not on the science side of things, but on the marketing and that side of things. So I just offer that as an observation. The other thing is just for people's information is that we as Pippa said, we don't put reef stars over seagrass. Where we're working on rubble fields that are alongside seagrass, we'll see, and we might actually build up to the seagrass. We'll see the seagrass actually growing up underneath reef stars over time. So in situations where you want to develop, you've got some patch of seagrass that's maybe small, and you want to expand that bed of seagrass, it may be that putting reef stars with no coral on them around the fringes of those patches, that you could actually encourage recruitment of the seagrass, because it's protected from predation and physical interference by some physical structure that's rigid but doesn't interfere with the light penetration. So just in terms of thinking about how we might do things in the tropics, you might actually be able to grow seagrass. We see this in Nusa Dua, actually. We see a lot of this in Nusa Dua, where seagrass is growing under the reef stars. So and then there's no question in there, I suppose, but maybe you could comment on that.
I guess it's a fair point what you say about trying to increase the celebrity of it, and I think we came from a very low starting point. I think 10 years ago, seagrass wasn't on the radar at all, and in some ways it is now. And I think there is huge change happening. It took a lot of bullying to convince the Blue Planet crew to actually includes seagrass in the Blue Planet 2, and that was a big success. And the guys in Western Australia managed to get them some good footage, which that was a big win, and that is I suppose in a sense that getting to that celebrity level. And there's a whole series of different organisations working to improve its view, and in some countries that's doing better than in others. And recently, with our restoration project in the UK, we did very well by working with WWF and Sky to get a huge amount of coverage that was sort of unprecedented. But I think you're right to raise that. It does need to get out there, and but people are picking up on it. I know, just to follow up on your point about sort of the coral reef seagrass sort of restoration links, I think there is a need to think about restoration from a sort of seascape scale, where you actually, when you're restoring one ecosystem, you're thinking about the other one. And people are beginning to do that with oysters, and thinking about some of the other animals that live in seagrass to be able to help improve the facilitation of seagrass restoration. And I've not seen the reef stars until Joss showing me the one on his wall earlier, so I don't really know a lot about that, and I can't comment really on much to do with reef restoration. But I think there's a fair case to try and work collaboratively between those sorts of restoration projects to have a bigger sort of impact, so they're not working in isolation, that they're actually working together. So in the UK, we're trying to actually bring some projects that are working on oyster restoration to trying to find locations that perhaps that we could work with seagrass restoration and link them up, so that they're not being conducted in isolation. And I think that probably needs to be considered from a tropical perspective, because there's a lot of effort that goes into mangrove work, and from a reef perspective, a mangrove and a seagrass meadow is an incredible filter that's keeping the crud, the contaminants off that seagrass, and giving it the best chances of being viable. So if you're working together, and if you are building that reef and restoring that reef, then you're protecting the seagrass and the mangrove from wave action as it grows and develops. So there's definitely a symbiosis there that needs to be thought about from a small and a sort of regional scale level. So I think it is a fair point. Yes, and also Susan Williams, great scientist. I never met her in person, but I had a lot of correspondence with her. I'm very, very sad loss to the seagrass community.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you for the question, Noel, and the comments as well. Okay, everyone, we're going to end it there. Rich, that was really a fantastic, really fantastic talk, and it was inspiring as well as so informative. So thank you again for taking the time to speak with us all today. Just a reference to everyone, I'll be sending the link for next week, but the Nature Comms paper that Rich was talking about, that Dan Exton was lead author on, it's Dan that's speaking next week on that fisheries. So yeah, so it'll link in nicely, and you'll be able to kind of see the flow of what Rich has been talking about and the fisheries sort of aspect of it in next week's seminar. So thank you again, Rich, much appreciated. Love to you and the family, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay, thank you guys for having me, and cheers, and hope I've at least inspired some of you to think about seagrass. So.
Most definitely. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening all, and a good day in the UK.
Thanks, Rich.